Puedes empezar, Leandro. Leandro, cuando quieras puedes empezar.
Bueno, entonces empezamos. Bienvenidos a la presentación de este libro que este, pone a dialogar dos tradiciones intelectuales importantes, como la teoría crítica y los nuevos materialismos. Este, eh, Tenemos la suerte de contar con dos de sus editores, así que bueno, estamos muy agradecidos de contar con el profesor Bueno y el profesor Henning, a los cuales voy a presentar en un ratito, más extensamente. Eh, Voy a hacer, después de una breve introducción de algunos 5 o 10 minutos, que voy a hablar un poquito de materialismo, le voy a dar la palabra a ellos y después de su presentación vamos a tener un tiempo de preguntas, un tiempo para discutir algunos de los contenidos, así que les pido que las preguntas las hagan por el chat. ¿Te parece bien, Andrés, que las preguntas sean por el chat? Y si hay preguntas de YouTube, las vamos haciendo y las vamos traduciendo, ¿no? Bueno, rápidamente hablar un poquito de materialismo. Cuando se habla de materialismo, naturalmente una de los representantes más mencionados y que está en el origen de la teoría crítica es la tradición social y política que remite a la obra de Marx. Sin duda la tradición de Spinoza es muy fuerte para los nuevos materialismos y también lo es para el marxismo, pero sin duda la obra de Marx es fundante para la teoría crítica. Me parece importante retenerlo aquí. Obviamente allí de lo que se trata no es de una tradición naturalista o mecanicista, sino que es claramente una concepción materialista de la economía, de la sociedad y finalmente de la historia, ¿no? Lo interesante de la figura de Marx como fundante de la teoría crítica, como del materialismo de la teoría crítica, es que se había manifestado ya Marx mismo críticamente con respecto a la tradición materialista anterior, ¿no? Es decir, y me parece interesante esto porque algunos de los temas de esa discusión de Marx con el viejo materialismo vuelven a aparecer en esta tradición con los nuevos materialismos. En ese sentido, ya Marx mismo se había manifestado en las tesis sobre Feuerbach, que la tradición materialista anterior eh, concebía la materia como el mundo exterior, la realidad exterior independiente de los sujetos y de la sociedad, ¿no? Es decir, para Marx, ese materialismo anterior no tenía en cuenta la parte activa de la acción del hombre, ¿no? Así que había sido para Marx desarrollada por el idealismo. Me parece que esto es interesante porque este gesto inaugural de poner a la agencia, poner a la praxis del hombre en el centro de un materialismo más contemporáneo, es un poco lo que va a ser discutido después por Charles Taylor en su artículo, digamos, ¿no? Esa centralidad de la agencia en el materialismo va a ser discutida después por Taylor. Eh, Obviamente, en ese contexto correspondía a Marx resaltar la actividad real, objetivante de la praxis humana, ¿no? Que es el trabajo, claramente. Es decir, para Marx no había una realidad independiente de la actividad humana, una realidad que ya no hubiera sido, de alguna manera, en la cual los individuos no hubieran intervenido, podríamos decir. La realidad es aquello con lo cual los sujetos ya se encuentran, vamos a decir. No obstante, no se trata de una realidad que no haya sido ya trabajada o constituida de alguna manera específica por las generaciones pasadas. El trabajo, que es central aquí en la tradición marxista, es un proceso entre la naturaleza y los individuos, los sujetos, en el cual estos de alguna manera se enfrentan a la naturaleza, pero lo hacen como fuerzas naturales. Interesante, igual esto es muy conocido en esta tradición, es que trabajar y constituir la realidad, los individuos por supuesto se constituyen a sí mismos, está claro, ¿no? Es decir, cambian su propia naturaleza este trabajo, en este constituir la realidad. También la escuela de Frankfurt, esto es interesante, y especialmente Horkheimer, en un artículo del año 37, es un artículo fundante también, de alguna manera resalta este aspecto del materialismo con respecto a una praxis creadora y una praxis constitutiva. Digamos, ¿no? Un artículo que a veces no aparece del todo mencionado, teoría tradicional y teoría crítica, en las discusiones por los nuevos materialismos. Es decir, para Horkheimer, el mundo está constituido por la razón humana, no obstante, la razón humana es producto de la naturaleza, y al mismo tiempo se realiza, por decir, en interacciones sociales específicas y en formas históricas específicas y concretas. En este proceso de reelaboración y apropiación de la naturaleza, también los individuos, para Horkheimer, se constituyen a sí mismos, digamos, ¿no? Hasta sus más íntimos detalles. Es decir, no solo en la vestimenta, no solo en las relaciones sociales, sino también en sus costumbres, sino también de la manera en la cual se siente, la manera que se ve, la manera que se escucha, es producto de un largo proceso evolutivo social de siglos. Es decir, para Horkheimer, los objetos que percibimos a través de los sentidos, los objetos de la realidad, están constituidos en un doble sentido, están configurados en un doble sentido. Primero por el carácter histórico de los objetos mismos, y después también por el carácter histórico de los órganos por los cuales percibimos esos objetos. Los sujetos son como productores producidos, para usar una expresión de Demirovich, en la forma en que nos apropiamos de la naturaleza. Una cosa interesante también del pensamiento de Marx como fundante del materialismo de la teoría crítica, es que Marx, ya a mediados del siglo XIX, había constatado que no hay naturaleza que ya no haya sido alterada por el hombre. Está en el siglo XIX, a mediados del siglo XIX. Este pensamiento de Marx obviamente estaba extendido y radicalizado por todas las teorías del antropoceno, ¿no? Esto está bien claro, ¿no? De otras formas, Marx pensaba que los sujetos, en tanto seres naturales, están obligados a apropiarse de la naturaleza, que no tienen opción ahí. Lo interesante para Marx no era esta obligación de apropiarse de la naturaleza, sino ver las formas en las cuales se produce esa apropiación de la naturaleza, ¿no? Cuáles son las relaciones productivas, podemos decir. Esto un poco ha cambiado en el contexto contemporáneo, en el contexto de las discusiones contemporáneas, ¿no? Claramente ha cambiado. Si la vieja cuestión marxista no es hoy, no da por presupuesto que nos tengamos que apropiar de la naturaleza, de todas formas se pregunta, bueno, ¿cuáles son las formas de producción y bajo qué forma se organiza el trabajo colectivo para apropiarse de la naturaleza? Esto, por supuesto, pone en el centro la cuestión de cómo se organiza el trabajo, cómo se concibe el trabajo, pero no solo eso, sino también cómo se concibe la corporalidad, cómo se concibe la sensorialidad, la sensitividad, o también cómo se concibe la relación entre los géneros, ¿no? Eso también está en el centro de la discusión. Muchas teorías contemporáneas del estructuralismo y postestructuralismo pueden ser entendidas como continuaciones de estos pensamientos de Marx. Cuando se dice, por ejemplo, que el habla, la cultura o la subjetividad son productos, no son productos contingentes o aleatorios, sino que están determinados por estrategias de poder o por determinaciones materiales, bueno, ahí es una continuación del pensamiento de Marx, sin duda está allí, ¿no? Un punto nodal, sin duda, en la extensión del materialismo contemporáneo es la figura de Althusser, ¿no? La figura de Althusser, que es una figura que aparece poco mencionada a veces, y su conocida afirmación de que no es el ser, sino la materia la que se dice de muchas maneras, ¿no? Esa es la famosa frase de Althusser, que dice, bueno, a temor de ser considerado neoaristotélico, bueno, me parece que la materia se dice de muchas maneras, ¿no? No es textual, pero es aproximado, ¿no? Es decir, muchas cosas muchas formaciones sociales que pensamos que son puramente espirituales o intelectuales, como por ejemplo, no sé, las creencias religiosas, en realidad están encarnadas en un conjunto de prácticas bien materiales, ¿no? Bien materiales. Y lo mismo pasa para el arte, o lo mismo pasa para el derecho. Es decir, Althusser lo que se proponía hacer entonces era extender la concepción materialista a ámbitos en los cuales inicialmente uno podría pensar que son materiales, digamos, ¿no? A Althusser obviamente allí le interesaban las ideologías, claramente, pero después rastrear una serie de otras otras formaciones sociales que pueden ser entendidas de un modo materialista. Me parece interesante también la figura de Althusser en ese sentido, porque algunos de estos pensamientos es posible encontrar un eco en la figura de Karen Barat, ¿no? De quien el libro, hay un capítulo de la figura de Karen Barat, y se la menciona mucho, es una representante importante de los nuevos materialismos, sin duda, ¿no? Un punto que se va a abordar seguramente en la presentación, aquí, pero conviene recordarlo, me parece, es que también aparece en la tradición del materialismo una crítica no solo de la concepción pasiva de la agencia, de la gente, sino también una concepción pasiva de la materia, ¿no? Esto es interesante, ¿no? Es decir, ya la teoría crítica, la vieja teoría crítica, pensaba que la materialidad de las cosas representaba como exigencias específicas, si se quiere, que debían resolverse en ese intercambio entre los sujetos, entre los individuos y la materialidad y la naturaleza. Obviamente la posición de Barat radicaliza muchos de estos pensamientos y los vuelve contra posiciones que pueden ser deducidas de las formaciones, de las encarnaciones más recientes de la teoría crítica, ¿no? Sobre todo aquellas que ponen en el centro el rol del lenguaje, ya sea desde un punto de vista realista o de un punto de vista constructivista. Obviamente allí la unidad en la naturaleza y la sociedad entre sujeto y objeto se lleva de cabo de una manera performativa para Karen Barat. De todas maneras, es de una manera mucho más radical de la que puede ser deducida de cualquier tradición del materialismo. Lo que se hace en esa obra es la profundización de una noción de la materia como agencia, sin duda, ¿no? La materia como agencia está trabajada así in extenso, podemos decir, de una manera radical o fundamental. La materia es producida, la materia es productiva y es activa históricamente, ¿no? De un modo que no había sido explorado por los antiguos materialismos, ¿no? Tanto por la teoría crítica de la Escuela de Frankfurt como por los materialismos de Marx, ¿no? Y me parece que este es uno de los méritos del libro y los méritos para aprovechar y discutir ampliamente, ¿no? Así que bueno, sin más, sin extenderme más, voy a presentar entonces, como dije, tenemos el gusto de tener al profesor Arthur Bueno y al profesor Christoph Henning. Quien va a hablar primero es el profesor Arthur Bueno. Lo presento. Arthur Bueno es profesor investigador de la Universidad de Frankfurt en la actualidad, es profesor invitado de la Universidad de San Pablo, y también es presidente de la Georg Simmel Gesellschaft de Bielefeld, y también, bueno, ha sido becario de la Fundación Humboldt en el Max Weber Center de la Universidad de Erfurt, y es en la actualidad investigador de los centros de investigación Normative Orders en Frankfurt y Law and Democracy en San Pablo. Así que bueno, es autor de varios libros, entre ellos el más reciente, Economies of Life, pero bueno, es una serie de publicaciones que los invito a buscar y a leer. Así que bueno, los dejo con la palabra de Arthur Bueno. Gracias por estar aquí, Arthur.
Muchas gracias, Leandro. Entonces, empiezo agradeciendo al profesor Leandro Paulich y también al profesor Andrés Crelier por la invitación, y también agradezco a todos los que están acá, los que han participado de la organización de este evento, así como todos los presentes. Es una alegría poder discutir este libro con vosotros y ampliar el debate entre la teoría crítica y los nuevos materialismos que propusimos con este volumen. Pido disculpas por mi español, que no es perfecto, pero espero que sea suficiente para que tengamos una discusión. Y lo que haremos, Christoph y yo, es presentar el libro y sus capítulos en líneas generales para luego podermos discutir algunos puntos más específicos con vosotros. Entonces, yo presentaré la parte respecto a la teoría crítica, y Christoph enfatizará la parte de los nuevos materialismos. Entonces, el libro reúne contribuciones de autores de esas dos corrientes intelectuales que hasta ahora se han desarrollado en gran medida a una distancia prudencial: la teoría crítica y el nuevo materialismo. Su intención es sondear el terreno entre esas dos escuelas de pensamiento, abordando sus diferencias fundamentales, así como sus posibles conexiones. En el centro de este debate se encuentran algunas de las cuestiones más acuciantes de la filosofía y la teoría social contemporáneas, como Leandro ya apuntó, en particular las que se refieren al estatus de controvertidas separaciones entre, por ejemplo, materia y vida, lo biológico y lo simbólico, la pasividad y la agencia, la afectividad y la racionalidad. Aunque a primera vista los teóricos críticos y los nuevos materialistas pueden parecer que adoptan posturas completamente diferentes con respecto a estas cuestiones, los desarrollos recientes en ambas tradiciones apuntan, creemos, a importantes convergencias entre ellas y por tanto preparan el terreno para una confrontación más directa y quizá una fertilización cruzada. Se ha considerado a menudo y de forma bastante paradójica que la teoría crítica contemporánea, nacida del espíritu del viejo materialismo histórico, como Leandro apuntó, toma una distancia excesiva respecto a la materialidad física y biológica del mundo. Al entenderse a sí misma como una continuación postmetafísica del proyecto incompleto de la ilustración kantiana, la teoría crítica ha anclado recientemente su horizonte político en las prácticas intersubjetivas de comunicación racional, como en Habermas, reconocimiento mutuo, como en Honneth, y justificación, como en Forst. A pesar de sus diferencias, todos estos enfoques han sido criticados por sostener concepciones antropocéntricas de la naturaleza e ideas racionalistas de la sociedad, que en última instancia derivan de su dependencia de la tradición filosófica del idealismo alemán. En consecuencia, argumentan los críticos, los aspectos materiales, vitales y afectivos de nuestro mundo se pasan por alto o se subordinan a procesos intersubjetivos de razonamiento normativo. Sin embargo, este punto de vista no ha permanecido incontestado. Trabajos recientes dentro de la teoría crítica han tratado de superar o intentar superar estas limitaciones recurriendo a otras tradiciones intelectuales y sobre todo reabriendo el debate sobre lo que puede llamarse el proyecto incompleto del romanticismo. Planteando el concepto de resonancia, Hartmut Rosa ha devuelto con más énfasis a la teoría crítica las actividades corporales y las relaciones con la naturaleza, estableciendo una conexión potencial con las líneas de pensamiento desarrolladas por los románticos. Del mismo modo, o de modo similar, Martin Zarr y Christoph Menke, por ejemplo, han abierto nuevos caminos para la teoría crítica al conectarla con argumentos filosóficos procedentes de la tradición romántica o que guardan importantes afinidades con ella. Recurriendo a Hegel y Nietzsche, Menke ha argumentado que la experiencia humana no puede entenderse simplemente en la línea de una teoría cognitivista de la acción, con su apelación a capacidades subjetivas, sino que debe tener en cuenta la dinámica vital inconsciente de lo que llama fuerza, Kraft. Hablaré un poco más de eso más adelante. En diálogo con obras no asociadas inmediatamente con la teoría crítica de la tradición frankfurtiana, como las de Gilles Deleuze, Antonio Negri y Etienne Balibar, Martin Zarr ha afirmado que la ontología política de Spinoza, con su énfasis en las dimensiones materiales y afectivas del poder, representa una alternativa a las perspectivas restringidas de la ilustración moderna y una contribución crucial a la crítica social contemporánea. También hablaré de eso adelante. Estos desarrollos han dado lugar a una serie de nuevos debates dentro de la teoría crítica. De hecho, a varios defensores del proyecto inacabado de la ilustración les preocupa que pueda haber algo intrínsecamente conservador en ese distanciamiento de las dinámicas intersubjetivas de la comunicación, del reconocimiento y de la justificación racionales. En su opinión, en la opinión de los críticos, el mayor énfasis en lo corpóreo, lo vital y lo afectivo corre el riesgo de privar la teoría crítica de los fundamentos racionales que ha establecido para la crítica social. Desde esta perspectiva, las nuevas tendencias dentro de este campo se asemejan a las teorías postestructuralistas criticadas por Habermas en el discurso filosófico de la modernidad. Una de las, y la obra de Hartmut Rosa ha sido muy criticada desde este punto de vista. Una de las principales cuestiones de este debate es si esta orientación más allá de la racionalidad conduce a un conservadurismo inevitable o si puede dar lugar a una visión y una crítica aún más radicales de la vida moderna. En este sentido, el reprobable paralelismo entre el giro neorromántico, por así decir, de la teoría crítica contemporánea y las teorías postestructuralistas podría no ser inconsistente e incluso resultar productivo para los enfoques criticados. A su vez, un giro similar hacia la naturaleza, la vida y el afecto ha tenido lugar en los debates postestructuralistas feministas y en los Science and Technology Studies en la segunda mitad de la década de 90, con la emergencia de una serie de teorías que Rosi Braidotti y Manuel de Landa fueron los primeros en designar como New Materialism. Tales esfuerzos se caracterizaron por un claro intento, paralelo a los esfuerzos de los teóricos críticos contemporáneos, de ir más allá de los límites del giro lingüístico en las humanidades. Un rasgo definitorio de esos trabajos es sobre todo la problematización de los dualismos que corrientes del pensamiento moderno, especialmente las identificadas con la Ilustración, han planteado en términos bastante restrictivos y jerárquicos. Materia versus vida, vida biológica versus vida simbólica, pasividad versus agencia, afectividad versus racionalidad. Confrontando estas concepciones dualistas, Karen Barad se propuso replantear las relaciones entre los seres humanos y los no humanos como interacciones. Entonces, no interrelaciones entre entidades distintas, pero interacciones entre procesos que se confunden. Jane Bennett ha cuestionado la distinción fundamental entre materia y vida, proponiendo un vitalismo crítico. Y Elizabeth Gross ha cuestionado los límites entre la vida biológica y la simbólica. Otra consecuencia de este solapamiento o superposición entre ámbitos que generalmente se consideran separados es que los potenciales posthumanistas planteados por los nuevos desarrollos tecnológicos pueden considerarse, tanto en sus efectos negativos como positivos, en continuidad con la materia, la vida y el afecto, y no simplemente en oposición a ellos. Los recientes desarrollos de la teoría crítica y del nuevo materialismo apuntan, pues, a una posible convergencia entre estas dos corrientes intelectuales. A pesar de sus diferentes orígenes, ambas han intentado poner en cuestión y superar las limitaciones del racionalismo antropocéntrico. Sin embargo, siguen existiendo importantes diferencias en la forma de proceder de cada una de estas corrientes a este respecto. Mientras que los teóricos críticos contemporáneos entienden en su gran parte que su tarea consiste en complementar o ampliar los límites del pensamiento de la Ilustración mediante el recurso a otras tradiciones o trabajando las tensiones internas a esta tradición, los nuevos materialistas tratan de desarrollar un cuestionamiento más radical del pensamiento moderno y un compromiso más directo con la naturaleza emaranhada de la materia, la vida, los afectos y la tecnología. En consecuencia, los defensores del nuevo materialismo consideran a menudo que los que trabajan en el campo de la teoría crítica están demasiado atrapados en una perspectiva antropocéntrica y basada en el lenguaje, mientras que los teóricos críticos suelen considerar que los nuevos materialistas abandonan con demasiada facilidad distinciones importantes entre naturaleza humana y no humana, ser y apariencia, epistemología y ontología. Y en el evento, la conferencia en la cual el libro se basó, mostró esto con particular claridad, fue un debate difícil entre los dos campos, por así decir, justamente en estos puntos. Así, el hecho que estos dos campos intelectuales compartan un mismo compromiso de ir más allá del racionalismo antropocéntrico, pero lleven a cabo dicho proyecto con estrategias intelectuales muy distintas, da pie a debates de gran relevancia en la teoría social y la filosofía contemporáneas. Sin embargo, hasta ahora no ha habido ningún intento específico de entablar un debate de ese tipo. Parte de la razón radica precisamente en las diferentes estrategias empleadas por esas dos corrientes en su esfuerzo común. Aunque coinciden en el objetivo, los caminos adoptados por cada una de ellas son fundamentalmente diferentes. Si bien es cierto que tanto la teoría crítica como el nuevo materialismo están marcados por disensiones internas, en la base de cada uno de ellos se encuentra un conjunto distintivo de presupuestos epistemológicos, ontológicos y prácticos. Estas son, de hecho, algunas de las dimensiones en las que se puede considerar que la teoría crítica y el nuevo materialismo adoptan posiciones divergentes o incluso diametralmente opuestas, y que por tanto dan forma a los debates presentados en este libro. El núcleo de sus desacuerdos, así como el lugar de sus posibles convergencias, puede identificarse en sus diferentes concepciones de la naturaleza. Entonces abordaré ahora el problema de la naturaleza en la teoría crítica. Para la teoría crítica, la naturaleza es el nombre de un problema. Durante mucho tiempo en la historia, la opresión y la explotación de los pobres, de las mujeres, de los trabajadores y de las minorías, así como los enfrentamientos entre los poderes políticos que trajeron la destrucción y la miseria sobre tantos, parecían ser hechos naturales. Estos fenómenos habían sido tratados por la economía política, desde Hobbes hasta Malthus y más allá, como explicables por medio de leyes naturales. El sistema económico del que se culpaba a la sociedad de clases evolucionaba con una necesidad férrea y despiadada, como si fuera llevado a cabo por seres controlados por instintos naturales, de modo que tal sistema también aparecía como parte de la naturaleza. En consecuencia, las ciencias que se ocupaban de estos procesos, por así decir naturales, se consideraban ciencias naturales, o bien formulaban leyes irrevocables, como hacía la economía política, o recogían los fenómenos sociales como si fueran cosas, como en las ciencias sociales positivistas. Sin embargo, aún más perjudiciales para los segmentos vulnerables de la población que la naturalización liberal del Estado, de la sociedad y de la economía modernos, fueron las concepciones darwinistas sociales planteadas contra el liberalismo a partir de finales del siglo XIX. Estas se basaban en ideas de la naturaleza que parecían aún más crueles y despiadadas que las liberales, aunque hay muchos que posteriormente abordaron sus continuidades. La selección natural se interpretó en última instancia como un conflicto racial, de modo que la segregación por color y raza o incluso el genocidio podían aparecer como fenómenos naturales. En ese contexto, se consideraba que la tarea de la teoría crítica consistía en deshacer o desnaturalizar la fijeza natural de las creencias establecidas, de los hábitos autoritarios, de las normas sexuales y raciales, etc. En estas circunstancias, el pensamiento progresista asumió a menudo que para dejar espacio a la libertad y la emancipación, había que restringir el ámbito de la naturaleza. Mientras que en la práctica esto conducía a un dominio por parte de la tecnología impulsada por la ciencia y a la explotación y expropiación de los recursos naturales, como por ejemplo Petra Gumplova aborda en su capítulo. En teoría, esto significaba desnaturalizar las fuerzas motrices de dichos procesos, es decir, desmitificarlas y descubrir su verdadera naturaleza, por así decir, que ya no era natural. Para las teorías críticas, detrás de ellos solía haber una no naturaleza, algo más humano y social, más plástico y cambiante, la razón, en el caso kantiano, o el espíritu en la variante hegeliana, o incluso más recientemente la cultura y la sociedad. Lo espiritualizada que estaba esta visión antinaturalista de la sociedad puede verse en el fuerte enfoque en la normatividad y la razón en los debates recientes dentro de la teoría crítica. En resumen, durante la mayor parte del siglo XX, criticar era desnaturalizar y ser crítico significaba ser un no naturalista. Es claro que esto es una afirmación muy general y la cuestión es mucho más compleja en los casos particulares, pero yo espero que vamos a explotar eso en la discusión. Lo que une a de esta perspectiva muy general, lo que une a estos diversos enfoques del otro de la naturaleza, la razón, el espíritu, la cultura, la sociedad, es que solo en este último podía fundamentarse el ámbito de la libertad. Solo en las versiones más radicales de estas filosofías se amplió el ámbito de la libertad para abarcar también la naturaleza, como en Fichte o en Schelling. Sin embargo, mientras esta forma espiritual de la libertad no se realice plenamente, acabamos teniendo al menos dos entidades, naturaleza y sociedad, o primera y segunda naturaleza. Y de hecho, como ha percibido acertadamente Bruno Latour con humor, la teoría crítica del siglo XX puede interpretarse en parte como un juego de purificación. Todos los lados naturalizados de la sociedad deben ser desnaturalizados y desmaterializados para liberarlos de la maldición del determinismo y de la opresión. El impulso parece claro contra la naturaleza. Y esta mentalidad se convertido en hegemónica en muchas teorías sociales de las últimas décadas y hasta hoy. En consecuencia, el ámbito de la naturaleza se ha vuelto cada vez más irrelevante en teoría, casi como un espejo del proceso en curso de cercamiento capitalista y destrucción ecológica. Una implicación crucial de este proceso es que las corrientes resultantes de la teoría crítica tenían sorprendentemente poco que decir sobre la crisis ecológica, como argumentaba Materialism en el volumen, a menos que pudieran mostrar que dicha crisis no es natural, sino normativa. Lo que interesaba a Habermas en el movimiento verde, por ejemplo, era el movimiento y no tanto el pensamiento verde que se desarrollaba. A medida que los problemas ecológicos se hacían más y más acuciantes a lo largo del siglo XX, muchas teorías vinieron a expresar y abordar tales preocupaciones, entre ellas los estudios feministas, incluso los enfoques marxistas. Sin embargo, el mainstream de la teoría crítica no ha cambiado sustancialmente su rumbo. Se puede decir que se ha centrado aún más en las normas y la normatividad. Con el tiempo quedó claro que para actualizar la teoría crítica y permitirle hacer frente a la crisis actual, era necesario renovarla y ocuparse de asuntos más terrenales, por así decir. Y es en este punto donde el diálogo con los nuevos materialismos se vuelve particularmente relevante. Es también a este desafío al que los autores del libro, cercanos a la tradición de la teoría crítica, trataron de responder, de intentar responder. Podemos identificar tres estrategias teóricas diferentes a este respecto. La primera consiste en exponer los límites de la teoría crítica al tratar la naturaleza. Aquí se trata de discutir de qué manera la concepción ontológicamente reducida de la naturaleza, que prevalece en los enfoques críticos actuales, limita seriamente lo que esta tradición tiene que decir en cuestiones de preocupación ecológica. Arne Johan Vetlesen, en su capítulo, relee la historia de la teoría crítica desde Horkheimer y Adorno hasta Habermas, argumentando que su concepción de la naturaleza era meramente instrumental, de modo que la emancipación se entendía como algo que iba en contra de la naturaleza o en contra de las leyes de la naturaleza. Mientras que el enfoque de Adorno y Horkheimer trata reductivamente la naturaleza externa como algo rígido y principalmente temible, pasando así por alto una larga historia humana de relaciones no instrumentales hacia los animales y el medio ambiente, sobre todo en el animismo. Es importante decir un paréntesis, porque es un poco más complejo que esto, pero el argumento de Vetlesen es que, sí, por supuesto, Adorno y Horkheimer presentan este proceso el proceso histórico de reducción de la naturaleza a algo inerte, a algo que puede simplemente ser apropiado como una cosa. Pero, y es verdad también que abordan una revolta de la naturaleza contra este proceso, pero conciben esta revuelta, según Vetlesen, solamente respecto a la naturaleza interna y no la naturaleza externa. Entonces, la naturaleza externa, según el autor, sigue presentando los trazos de algo que es inerte o que puede ser instrumentalmente apropiado. Y también es verdad que en larga medida, cuando Adorno y Horkheimer conciben el proceso de naturalización, lo conciben como, sí, como un proceso de enriquecimiento, como una fixación de algo, sí, de la naturaleza, del hombre y sobre todo. Habermas continuó esta línea de pensamiento, o tal vez tenga aún radicalizado, fusionando el conocimiento de la naturaleza con las tecnologías abstractas del trabajo industrial y de la ciencia moderna, ignorando igualmente el conocimiento local de la naturaleza en las culturas premodernas o sobre todo animistas, que es el foco de Materialism, o que parece ver como una salida posible. Porque Habermas, según Materialism, ha concebido la naturaleza externa sobre todo como algo que puede ser instrumentalmente apropiado. La teoría crítica deja así de lado una de las preocupaciones más acuciantes a las que tiene que responder hoy en día, las preocupaciones ambientales. En una línea similar, Petra Gumplova examina el modo en que se concibe la naturaleza en las actuales nociones jurídicas de justicia global, indicando que esa comprensión reductora de la naturaleza está en juego no solo en el pensamiento, como mostró Fetlesen, sino también en las prácticas materiales. Su capítulo muestra cómo los conceptos políticos de soberanía territorial están ligados a una práctica de dominación sobre la naturaleza que concibe a esta última como un recurso a extraer y explotar. En consecuencia, los recursos naturales no solo satisfacen legítimamente las necesidades humanas, sino que también sustentan normas injustas y muchas formas de desigualdad. Frente a esto, Gumplova aboga por un renovado lenguaje de la justicia que incluya a los pueblos indígenas y rechaza los desposeimientos violentos. Aquí también entonces ve que hay una similaridad con Fetlesen en la medida que hay una valorización y una énfasis en la importancia de mirar estas otras maneras de se relacionar con la naturaleza, que no solo la moderna. Y una cosa que es importante que Fetlesen enfatiza en Adorno y Horkheimer es que aunque ellos sean críticos al proceso de dominación de la naturaleza, la manera por la cual ellos conciben las relaciones premodernas con la naturaleza es es como un preámbulo de la forma moderna, es ya marcada por la forma moderna. Entonces, la relación con la naturaleza, según Adorno y Horkheimer, es muy marcada por el sentimiento del miedo. Por ejemplo, y entonces, volviendo a Gumplova, en la medida en que hace de los derechos humanos la norma clave de un ejercicio justo de los derechos sobre los recursos, este lenguaje, el lenguaje de la justicia que ella propone, debería hacer que los gobiernos rindan cuentas a los intereses medioambientales de la humanidad. Una segunda estrategia consiste en conectar la teoría crítica con la tradición romántica para responder a la pregunta de cómo podría superarse una postura instrumental y cosificadora hacia el mundo. Aunque ni Charles Taylor ni Hartmut Rosa lo hacen explícitamente en sus capítulos para el libro, esta perspectiva, esta conexión con el romanticismo caracteriza el camino tomado por ellos en sus trabajos y subyace en sus contribuciones al volumen. En su texto Resonance and Critical Theory, Charles Taylor cuestiona dos valores centrales que son apreciados por los racionalistas de hoy en día: la agencia en oposición a la pasividad y la racionalidad en oposición al sentimiento. Según él, una crítica a la alienación que solo se centra en la pérdida de agencia, como se puede ver en juego, por ejemplo, en los enfoques liberal, lockeano y marxista, según Taylor, nos ciega ante otra pérdida prevalente en la modernidad, la pérdida de nuestra capacidad de experimentar, de nuestra receptividad, o que él llama patience. Entonces, Taylor se pone del lado de Rosa al subrayar este segundo tipo o dimensión de la alienación, un sufrimiento de un mundo que se ha vuelto silencioso. Entonces, la alienación para Taylor no es meramente una cuestión de una pérdida de agencia, de un mundo que es heterónomo, pero también un mundo que se vuelve silencioso, un mundo con lo cual uno no se conecta más afectivamente. Y para él esta conexión depende de manera fundamental de esta actitud que no es de pasividad, más que es de una patience, de una manera de estar abierto al mundo, de estar receptivo. El objetivo de la teoría crítica es, pues, ir más allá de la agencia, hacia una postura ética más abierta y en intercambio receptivo con el mundo. Se trata de un camino similar al que emprende Rosa en su capítulo, pero sin referirse al ámbito de la estética, sino al de la experiencia existencial o religiosa. Rosa ha escrito una sociología de las relaciones con el mundo en la que explora sistemáticamente cómo los sujetos están inmersos en un mundo lleno de relaciones, donde la alternativa es entre un mundo que nos habla, que habla con nosotros, en dimensiones vitales como la naturaleza, el arte, la historia o la religión, o un mundo que permanece en silencio, un mundo que permanece extraño a nosotros. En este texto, Rosa sostiene que el enfoque de Bruno Latour aborda cuestiones similares. En particular, a Rosa le interesa la forma en que Latour aborda el problema de cómo podemos superar la ontología reducida de los modernos, que divide el mundo en sujetos y objetos, sujetos activos, objetos pasivos, y llegar a una comprensión más rica de los seres que nos rodean. Es sobre todo la visión de Latour sobre la religión la que despierta el interés de Rosa, pues es aquí donde el pensador francés se acerca más a una teoría de la resonancia, dado que Latour redescribe la religión con una apelación, a call, que exige una respuesta. En este sentido, Rosa sostiene que la ontología relacional de Latour puede ayudarnos a superar la crisis ecológica, económica y moral de nuestra modernidad actual. Hay, por tanto, una conexión importante con la crítica de Materialism, por ejemplo. Es como si lo que Materialism clamaba es intentado aquí por Taylor y Rosa y Latour. En tercer lugar, otras contribuciones del libro adoptan una estrategia diferente para hacer frente a las carencias de la teoría crítica contemporánea. En lugar de intentar construir una alternativa al marco del racionalismo moderno, como es una tendencia en Rosa y Taylor, más bien elaboran las tensiones internas de la propia ilustración. Al recurrir a Spinoza, Martin Zar y Kerstin Anderman muestran que no toda la ilustración era tan problemática al final, una vez que nos dirigimos a la tradición naturalista radical. Mientras que Zar busca nuevos conceptos de poder y socialidad informados por Spinoza y la reciente erudición spinozista, Anderman pretende reformar nuestro pensamiento de la individualidad en términos de transindividualidad. Zar sigue a Spinoza al repensar el poder no como algo necesariamente localizado en el individuo, en las acciones individuales, sino como un campo de fuerzas inmanentes que se unen y combinan entre sí, y que puede conducir a la creación y no solo a la destrucción, como lo hacía el paradigma hobbesiano. Entonces hay acá una perspectiva radicalmente inmanente que parte de los potenciales, de los poderes, del campo de poderes para pensar lo que es posible y para imaginar futuros alternativos. Aunque en sí misma puede no ser crítica, dice Sarr, esta perspectiva contribuye a la teoría crítica porque invita a la transformación e imagina otras posibilidades desde la perspectiva inmanente de la vida misma y no como una cuestión de normas o leyes. Y podemos pensar qué tipo de relación se establece con normas o leyes, o principalmente la normatividad, desde esta perspectiva. Asimismo, Anderman se pregunta por los fundamentos ontológicos del campo social desde una perspectiva neoespinozista, informada por Etienne Balibar y Deleuze, afirmando que en la teoría del afecto de Spinoza la individualidad es ya transindividualidad. Finalmente, para Christoph Menke, la ilustración es el nombre de una estructura paradójica, la paradoja de la capacidad. Mientras que la noción de capacidad pretende definir la forma de una libertad positiva como autonomía, en el sentido que se considera que un sujeto consiste en alguien que es capaz de hacer algo útil para los otros, algo que tenga valor, incluso valor económico. Al mismo tiempo, esta creencia fundamental naufraga por la sospecha de que las capacidades siguen siendo heterogéneas a la subjetividad y por lo tanto están indisolublemente conectadas a un poder que es externo al sujeto y que lo somete. Y acá hay una perspectiva en la agencia similar a la que Taylor criticaba. Menke afirma que la estética constituye un ámbito privilegiado para explorar esta paradoja. En el conflicto entre una concepción de la belleza como valor y una concepción de belleza como fuerza, lo que está en juego es si somos sujetos en cuanto a instancias de capacidad, como Hobbes, por ejemplo, propone, o si somos a la vez menos y más que sujetos capaces. En la primera concepción, que Menke retrasa a Hobbes, la experiencia de la belleza se entienden como una forma de capacitación, es decir, como una preparación para convertirse en un sujeto plenamente capaz, en condiciones de desempeñar sus funciones en la vida práctica social. Entonces, según Menke, en una estética de la belleza como valor, se trata de, en la experiencia estética, adquirir capacidades para hacer frente a un mundo que demanda capacidades. Pero, sin embargo, sí, acá esa experiencia se ve perturbada por el reconocimiento de que el sujeto en realidad se está sometido a un poder externo. Entonces, hay un paradojo acá entre capacidad y incapacidad, pero los dos términos se presentan separados. En la segunda concepción de una estética de la fuerza, esta tensión se interioriza. El paradojo se interioriza. La experiencia de la belleza implica no la experiencia de que uno es capaz de algo, sino de que es incapaz. Es decir, de que es movido por una fuerza inconsciente, sin rumbo y sin gobierno. El arte ofrece entonces la posibilidad de jugar con esta fuerza y por tanto de transformar nuestras prácticas. Entonces acá la perspectiva no es que la experiencia estética nos prepara para ser sujetos capaces, y sí que nos presenta la posibilidad de jugar con nuestra propia incapacidad. Y así se abre la perspectiva de una transformación de la práctica y no simplemente de una capacitación, de una preparación para la vida social tal como se presenta. Lo que la belleza del arte permite en esta perspectiva que aparezca es precisamente lo que no podemos hacer, dice Menke. La belleza promete la posibilidad de una práctica diferente. Entonces, es eso. Entonces, son tres perspectivas. Yo paro por acá y paso la palabra a Leandro y a Christoph.
Bueno, perfecto. Bueno, gracias Arthur por la expresión muy clara, gracias por el castellano. Escuchamos ahora entonces al profesor Henning. Voy a presentarlo brevemente. El profesor Henning es miembro del Max Weber Center de la Universidad de Erfurt, ha estudiado en Berlín, ha estudiado en Dresden y en Nueva York y en Suiza antes de ser profesor en Erfurt. Sus libros más recientes incluyen Philosophy After Marx, Theories of Alienation, and Political Philosophy of Perfectionism, entre otros. Así que bueno, le agradecemos por estar aquí al profesor Henning y lo escuchamos. We hear you, Professor Henning.
Okay, thank you. I have to switch to English, and I'm going to continue with the other side. Arthur was speaking about the critical theories, and I'm going to jump into the new materialism. The recent trend of new materialism is reacting to a different problem. It's concerned not with a threatening nature as critical theory is, but rather with the real-life crisis of nature we all experience, and with a disregard for ecological issues in social theory. In both these regards, new materialism starts by questioning the subordination of nature. The basic impulse is to question the dualism that is so typical for modern thought and practice. In the eyes of new materialism, modernity is built on the basis of a conceptual opposition between matter and mind, in which matter appears as distinct and subordinate to mind. Mind, or spirit, stands for activity, value, transcendence, basically everything good, whereas matter, on the other hand, appears as passive, cold, dead, meaningless, everything bad. For new materialism, this dualism explains the limits of modern thought as well as its practical problems with the ecology, but also with racial and gender issues and so on. This is why they consider it necessary to question or traverse this dualism. In contrast to that dualism, they propose a monist philosophy of immanence, which focuses on matter and abstains from conceiving it as something inert and destined to be inspired and molded by spirit, or even represented by spirit. The point is not simply to emphasize the pole of matter at the expense of the other pole of spirit, but rather to go beyond this dualism that establishes them as poles. There should be no order of things, no prioritization or foundation. It's not a question of posing matter against spirit or vice versa, but of thinking them in their mutual affirmation or co-constitution. Thus, instead of the dualism nature-spirit, which is often seen as equivalent with the dualism of body and mind, subject and object, or fact and value, what appears here is a unity of nature culture, material discursive, it's one word, or material semiotic, material semiotic. Instead of an interaction between different and contradictory elements, there's a continuous intra-action, Arthur was speaking about that already, of forces and matters, as Barat called it. And so far, the underlying ontology. In terms of epistemology, new materialism aspires to the formulation of a connecting position that does not treat elements of the world as organized in an opposition between matter and mind, or between empirical and transcendental, but rather explores their complex imbrications without assuming a priority of one over the other, or even without assuming them as distinct. In so doing, new materialism differs from two other epistemological positions. It distinguishes itself on the one hand from the positivist reductionism that essentializes nature as mechanical or quasi-mechanical and explains everything else on its base. On the other hand, it distinguishes itself from a postmodern social constructivism which conceives of nature as mere magma to be molded by culture and thus ends up falling into a reified social idealism or culturalism. The Swedish feminist Lena Gunnarsson interprets this as a naturalistic turn, so new materialism is a turn to nature. However, this newly evolving philosophy of nature may not be an easy fix to the shortcomings of critical theory, so you cannot just put them together. Instead, it raises a number of problems of its own. New materialism's reaction to the emptiness of constructivism and its attempt to avoid dualism provoke an abandonment of distinctions that might be crucial for social critique as well as for its own project. So it goes too far, that's the criticism. A major insight that started the critical enterprise in the first place with the publication of Immanuel Kant's Three Critiques was the differentiation between thought and reality, theory and practice, and also ontology and epistemology, of course. Following Bruno Latour and Karen Barat, new materialists often forgo these elementary distinctions. Because they have been so crucial for criticism, we think they should not be given up so quickly. From the perspective of critical theory, the problematic issues in new materialism can be summarized as follows in this 4 points now. First, once the distinction between matter and mind is dropped, intellectual discourse and natural processes appear as one and the same thing, as agential cuts or intra-actions, as Barat calls it, which brings external causality, organic self-preservation, and willful action or intentional action on one flat level. On the upside, this may lead to feelings of kinship, closeness, and responsibility, not only toward human beings and animals, but also towards landscapes, microbes, bacteria, even the universe as a whole. Indeed, this new mode of fellow feeling, of tuning in, is intended by Karen Barat, Jane Bennett, or Donna Haraway and others, maybe also by Hartmut, Rosa. In critical theory, Herbert Marcuse has already developed a similar new sensibility, and the concept of resonance is also aiming at something quite similar. On the downside, however, this new feeling is not overcoming anthropocentrism, but rather is expanding it. The leveled field can lead to the idealistic notion that natural processes or the ecological crisis are caused by ideas that some people held, and consequently, it would be a solution to our notorious ecological problems if we change our thinking, for example, or feeling. If we no longer think in terms of subject and object, nature and culture, but rather perceive them as a unity and approach them more mindfully or effectively. Surely, thinking is a material process and its transformation may have bearings on future action. And this is, of course, a main assumption in ecological education, if you work with kids in the forest, for example. But research from sociology shows that a stated ecological consciousness does not go hand in hand with a more sustainable way of life. Theory and practice again. Hence, in itself, it does not change much. Even if we acknowledge the material aspect of thought and conversely, the semiotic sides of materiality, it remains important to keep in mind what separates material and language practices. For example, an intellectual analysis and a material political implementation are not the same. Heidegger's notion that the state of the world depends on our thinking or feeling of it, on our world picture, may not overcome but rather inflate our anthropocentrism and even a self-indulgent subjectivism or aestheticism, as it primarily focuses on our ideas, our feelings, and our perceptions. The hasty claim that with a changed attitude we already changed the world may thus lead to political quietism, which means doing not so much, and to a disregard of the hard sciences even. Second point, if an identity of being and thinking is assumed without mediation, I mean, that's the whole Hegel story, an important critical tool is abandoned, the comparison of ideas with the part of reality they aim to describe, formerly called ideology critique, and which is at the moment mocked as a cult of anti-fetishism by, for example, by Bruno Latour and others. Is the difference between nationalist or racialized conceptions, as they are on the rise in many countries, and a more inclusive, mindful, and pluralist compositism, that's Haraway, intended by new materialism, fully grasped by a look at the mode of their attunement to the cosmos alone? I mean, is that all that matters, that you have a look at how they feel for the cosmos? Don't they both try to jump right into it, bite into the flesh and blood of real life? I mean, there are different ways to do it, but they both do it. How do we respond to neoliberal or populist approaches to ecological problems once they also claim to be mindful and caring for the planet? I mean, it's an easy claim to make, maybe. What's the problem with earlier versions of naturalized politics, like the damnation of homosexuality as unnatural in religious approaches, for example? What's the problem with that, really, that they excluded nature, as Latour would tell us, or rather that they included and used nature in a way that was against scientific knowledge and also politically disrespectful of many groups? How do we account for these differences once what matters is reduced to whether or not an approach is dualist or not? This might not be enough to cover the ground of political differences and contestations in our complex real life. Third, there's no need to decry every distinction as dualism. Again, to quote Lena Gunnarsson, if we see distinctions as such as the problem, we rid ourselves of the possibility of examining the relation, the two terms, and the relation between the two terms, and one of them will inevitably subsume the other. End of quote. Even if entities are close-knit and rarely act or change in isolation, like persons in a family, or in a marriage, or a family dog, or trees in the forest, so they are in a network, it's possible and sometimes useful to look at the entities or persons separately. If you go to the doctor, you don't bring your family. This is neither atomistic nor dualistic. In fact, it enhances the plurality of perspectives, which would be lost if we only embrace the assemblage or the relations between them. The personalities also play a role, maybe as the decisive one even. A closer look at the history of the old materialism and the history of critical theory from Kant to, let's say, Lukács, reveals that a full-blown dualism or mechanistic materialism has hardly ever been maintained, but that's the main claim. Quite the contrary, the Hegelian heritage always compels critical theory to take the unity behind the differences into account. But unity in difference is not a unity of gray and gray, or a fusion or a flat thing. It calls for distinctions. To be critical in a literal sense, from the Greek word krinein, to distinguish, means to be aware of these differences, not melting them into one pot without letting them undermine the coherence of that unity. All of that, what I'm saying, is the critical criticism against the neo-materialist thing. This requires conceptual rigor. The art of seeing identity and difference together goes beyond the alternative between dualism and monism, where everything becomes one. A fourth point, we may also stress that within a given unity, there can be different gradations, magnitudes, stratifications, layers, or scales. So something in between. If there's not just one great divide between object and subject or nature and culture, there can be no one-off mediation between them, no immediate unity between just two entities. There's much more pluralism than the rigid image of dualism implies. And here comes an example of the seasons. Maybe that's a bit simple, but take the seasons, for example. There's a clear phenomenological difference between summer and winter. It's hot or cold. Stressing a unity here means to interpret them both as seasons and as recurring, but that does not mean that they are one, that they are the same thing. Also, in between, there are two more entities, spring and autumn, and that's the point of the scales here, with medium temperatures. So neither are we overcoming dualism of summer and winter once we see their commonalities, nor can we jump over spring and fall as stages or degrees between them. New materialism rightly stresses that ontological levels can be used to construe hierarchical relations and can thus be ethically and politically problematic, of course. Mind is supposedly higher and hence more valuable than matter. That's one of the things we need to be afraid of, or the claim that men are more rational and more valuable than women, or comparable fallacies. It's clearly wrong, but it's based on a conceptual hierarchy. Nevertheless, it's equally problematic to disregard these differences in terms of gradation and scope. Agency in cells is different from that one in minerals. It has different characteristics in plants, animals, humans, and so on. Ordering them all in one plateau might risk not doing justice to these entities. It rather invites projections of anthropocentrism or morphism, thus obscuring the particular responsibility that human beings have for the future life on the planet. And that's the main thing to be afraid of. Critical theory, which is based more in sociology than in literature, is looking at the way our knowledge of the world is shaped by the forces driving social and political life. It can thus be of help preventing confusions between different dimensions of reality, between distinct aspects of thought about reality, and between different ways of dealing with the practical problems entailed by such a reality. Yet, as we've seen, the perspectives opened up by new materialism points to important shortcomings of critical theory as it has been recently developed. I think Leandro talked about that in the beginning. In particular, its uncritical adoption of dualism that tend to subordinate matter to spirit, the biological to the social, affectivity to rationality, or also economics to discourse or norms. How exactly to promote a cross-fertilization between these two intellectual currents is the main question that we aimed with this book, and Arthur has already presented half of the papers, and I'm going to just go through the rest of them quickly. First of all, there's Arthur himself, together with Heike Delitz. I would say they are in the middle of these two camps. Heike Delitz, sociologist, is drawing from French Bergsonianism, particularly as articulated by Canguilhem, Deleuze, and Simondon. She articulates a critical vitalism that attempts to go beyond the common distinctions of order versus disorder, normal versus pathological, or life versus technology. And that would allow one to see more possibilities than the, quote, technophobic, anthropocentric, and determinist theories of societies did so far. Arguing that all societies are undetermined, Delitz's vitalism is directed against evolutionary theories and historical materialism in the name of the unforeseeable, intentive, or inventive character of human life. Life is the thing that connects to Arthur's paper. The tradition of a philosophy of life is also at stake in his chapter and your chapter, in which new materialist ontologies of life are contrasted with critiques of social pathology from contemporary critical theory. While both approaches resort to the concept of life in order to respond to the troubles posed by the crisis of modern life forms, they do this in ways that are often deemed incompatible. For Arthur, a reconstruction of Simmel's assessment of modern life provides an encompassing framework that allows one to retain the fruitful aspects of both perspectives while avoiding their theoretical insufficiencies. A critique of social pathologies can thus be articulated, which accounts for both the normative dysfunction of modern life forms and the longing for experiences of vitality that emerge in the context of the crisis, and the problems that evolve if we stick to either of these sides. So they need to be connected. Dealing head-on with new materialist approaches, Dolphin and Kai Merton draw conclusions for contemporary culture and theories of the self by using examples from dance theater, literature, and science studies. Dolphin shows, he's the one who edited one of the earliest collections on new materialism. He shows how after 68, many French theories aimed at reinventing theories of the subject that were more inclusive, equal, and diverse than the Cartesian hierarchies of the past. New materialism is a reaction to this post-68 mode of critique insofar as criticism based on analysis of language were, according to Dolphin, still driven by a dualist desire to divide the world, and that means between language and materiality, between male and female, and so on. New materialism thus appears as a continuation and radicalization of 68, or you could say 68-2.0. Dolphin endorses Braidotti's monist explorations to develop non-dualist perspectives, where language is read not as a representation, but as an active part of that matter in movement. So it's all in one. With Masumi, Dolphin describes the dance theater of Pina Bausch from Germany as an example for such a relational ontology. Movements create a dancing body. It's not the body that expresses the dance, it's rather the dance that creates the body. Subjectivity in this perspective is ever becoming. And diving into the work of Karen Barat, Kai Merton compares her onto-epistemological entanglement with Hans Blumberg's proposal of making the world legible. Hans Blumberg is a German philosopher who worked on metaphors mainly. While representation seems to presuppose given objects that are revealed, Barat's notion of diffractive reading acknowledges that the process of reading creates differences in the represented phenomenon. So they haven't been there before. Yet Merton wants to extend that notion from cultural to natural phenomena. And to this effect, he uses Bloomberg's notion of reading the genome as one that is co-creative of the genome itself. So knowing about it creates it. Against Barat, however, Merton stresses that this process presupposes distance to nature, not entanglement with it. It's still the scientist who does it. In describing scientific experiments, Barat presupposes researchers who decide and control the outcome of the experiment. So Merton insists that diffractive reading needs to posit an I, and a subject, separate from the intra-active becoming of the world. When this subject is taken into consideration, the new method of critique can also push to new spheres of ethical responsibility. However, with Merton, we continue to distinguish the world and its perception in the subject. And that's based on Barat, which is somehow strange. Finally, the chapter of Claire Blenko, myself, and Elmar Fletcher seek to combine aspects from critical theory and new materialism into one fusion. Like Taylor and Rosa, Blenko sees the downsides of a rationalist modernism focused on control and combines that with the criticism of neoliberal privatization that is in bed with racism. She inquires whether ecological attunement can provide a counter to today's barbarism. For this, she looks at three feminist figures who articulate alternatives. That's the Enchantress with Jane Bennett, and there's the Witch with Starhawk, and the Intrusion of Gaia with Isabel Stengers. And she's asking how these figures speak to popular politics that could lift out of despair. And she shows in this paper that whereas efforts to re-enchant overlook that we already are enchanted, the witch from Starhawk mainly appeal to white middle classes. That's her criticism. And the intrusion of Gaia addresses people who already are in the sciences or the ecological movement. So we don't make any political progress here. Hence, all three figures, though impressive in their achievements, remain limited in scope and politically vague. To give you a quote, chaos spiritualizes, so that's a good thing, but all manners of spirits roam. So that means it can go in all kinds of directions. Like Dolphin, Blanco ends up with a hopeful look at spiritualizing dance cultures from ska to grime, reminding us that a counter movement should appeal to a broader public. So dance is spreading out. On the other hand, critical theory also needs inspiration from materialist tendencies. To show that in my own paper, I delve into art practices and aesthetics, as Menke and Taylor do it as well. But I focus not so much on receptivity as Menke does, but rather on the productive side of the arts, in showing that when artists talk about their production process, I interviewed them and they reported an interaction with tools, materials, forms and ideas which revealed a certain agency of things, which is not a theory from some sociologists, but what people tell me themselves when I ask them. These practical experiences flesh out ideas put forward by Jane Bennett and Bruno Latour in theory. So that means that new materialist philosophies and interviews with artists and designers resonate and energize one another. So if you read them together, and that demonstrates empirically that ideas of Latour and Bennett make sense for understanding aesthetic practices. But interpreting these experiences also revives critical theories in as much as they rely on aesthetics as a field that allows for a critical distance towards commodification and art markets. So this distance is what the artists themselves claim to have and practice. And finally, the last paper by Elmar Fletcher that ends the book with a detailed criticism of new materialism, hinting at ways how it could be undertaken with a bit more bite when combined with empirical tools and a conceptual structure from critical theory. I'm afraid it's not going to happen, but at least this is his idea. His criticism shows that new materialist authors are lacking clarity in no less than 5 fields. I don't mention them now, but it's a very intense critique. While the focus on interaction results in the difficulty to talk about nature in a systematically objective way, the monist ontology undermines distinctions and leaves categories vague. With the resulting espousal of indeterminacy, new materialism offers no criteria for critique. That's a harsh critique. Fletcher endorses Rosa's theory of acceleration, Hartmut Rosa, one of the editors, as an alternative, arguing that the materiality that needs to be studied is energy, not simply as an acting matter, but as a social relation mediating the natural and social sides of modern materiality. Indeed, insights on the agency of things from this perspective that do not give up on a critical conceptual framework that have been undertaken in recent critical studies. That means also looking at politics, also looking at economics. And examples for these are studies of things like sugar or cotton or palm oil or phosphor. I mean, there are studies about these entities, but they do not draw out the economic side. These economic studies of things are a very promising way, I think, or we think, to combine new materialism and critical theory. And with this, I'm through as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Henning. Okay, we can go on with questions. Vamos con las preguntas ahora. Les pido, por favor, que si alguien tiene preguntas, se anuncia al chat y las hacemos. Quien se anima a hacerla directamente en inglés, las hace en inglés, si no, se las traducimos. Así que, bueno, les pido que se anuncien al chat para ir haciendo las preguntas, tanto al profesor Henning como al profesor Artur Bueno. Bueno, si nadie... A ver. Bien, Diego, adelante.
Thanks, Artur and Christoph, for your presentations. Congratulations for the book. I think it's a very important contribution to explore the relationships between those two traditions, critical theory and materialism. I think it has many implications for other disciplines. For instance, for studies in philosophy and technology, ontological problems about nature and culture, etc. My question is about dualism as a category. One thing that emerges from the prologue of the book is that the new materialism has a conceptual arsenal that is better suited to deal with the real life crisis, global warming, energy crisis, etc. In this framework, what is the real status of the problem of dualism? This is to say, what kind of dualism we are talking about? Maybe the appropriate question is not how to overcome dualism. That is a question that appears in the book, along all the book, but rather how useful is this and this dualist category to illuminate, in this case of analysis, its human and non-human component and agencies, the demands at stake, the components of the analysis, the case analysis. Maybe the question is not to remove dualism as a whole, but to try to assess the subordination of one component to another, something that defines a good part of dualisms. It seems that it's not a struggle against that homogeneous entity called dualism, but rather a struggle against some categories that emerges in a framework of case analysis. I enjoyed very much the chapter Christoph Henning wrote about artistic practices, a Latourian view about artistic practices. In that chapter, I think it's a way, we can find a way to evaluate dualism not at a homogeneous category, because in that chapter, that is my question, what role played dualism in that specific case of analysis? Yes, in the artistic practices in a Latourian way. That's my question. Thanks.
I can try. Oops.
We hear you. It's okay.
I can try to answer quickly.
Perfect. Go ahead.
I think so. Why do they think that dualism is the problem, and what could be a solution? Well, maybe Arthur and myself are not on one page here, but I would say it's a little bit too much Heideggerian French thinking behind there, because what is really odd, which strikes me as odd, is that yes, there are cases when we objectify people, for example, right? When we treat them as things with reification. And then the problem, of course, is that somehow subject and object have different statuses, and somehow we work with this subject-object distinction. That's a problem. We shouldn't do it. So we should get rid of the subject-object distinction. And there are some cases where I think that makes pretty much sense. But why do I mention Heidegger? Because there is a categorical frame, that the frame which tries to make us believe that with this distinction between subject and object, that's where hell breaks loose already. That's the whole problem. Because we can say that, okay, we have subject and object, then we have mind and body, then we have culture and nature, then we have ethics and facts, then we have the living and the dead. And we can make this distribution here and there. It's almost as in structuralism. And of course, with all these distinctions, nature, culture, come so many problems that we do not treat the animals right, and we don't treat the rainforest right. That's because we think they are objects. And that's That's the point where I think, no, that's not the main reason. That's maybe one of the reasons, but there are so many other reasons. But these reasons we can only find if we have a look into political science, if we have a look into political economics, if we have a look into racial dynamics of societies, and we don't solve that problem if we just change our thinking. That's one of the things. But then the question is, how else could we possibly think? And that's the solution with the stages between them. I mean, it's not said that you can only have two. Distinctions are important. Sometimes you only have these two, but why don't we open up for the possibility that there might be 3 options or 4 options or 5 options, right? So we can distinguish humans and animals somehow. We can say there's a unity, but we can make a distinction, but then there are also plants, then there's bacteria, and then there's the earth, let's say the humus, of course, and we can see that they are all united because they have certain commonalities, but we can draw distinctions that don't divide them. But that's not two. It's not that one is an object and the other is a subject or something, but it's just that they have different levels of complexity and they have different characteristics. Even so, subject-object doesn't really apply to these descriptions of reality, and that's why I think it's making things too easy, and it's proposing a easy fix. And I didn't say anything about the art stuff, but that's I think a good example, because it shows you that, of course, objects can act, so that we find categories that are on the good side, like cultural ethics. What did I say? Agency. We can find that on the side of things, of course. Yes. But that means that we cannot apply this rigid categorical frame. Once we do empirical work, that means, yeah, we have to open up. And that's the good thing in Latour, I think, that he tells us not to come with a fixed, categorical frame and say, this is that and this is that. No, that's not the way the sciences work. Okay, sorry.
Perfect. Arthur, you want to say something?
Yes, I pretty much agree with what Christoph says. As always, perhaps I'm just gonna try to defend a bit the new materialism, not because I'm a new materialist, but just for the sake of the cross-fertilization. That's so I guess, I mean, their view, and it's I think very well represented by Rick Dolphin's chapter in the book, is that where he says actually that he doesn't want to criticize, and the critique is a problem. And why does he see critique as a problem? Because working with this dualism, subject and object, in very simplistic terms, but just for the sake of the debate, so either you're an active subject or you're a passive object. And then, of course, you can criticize that one is being objectified, but then either it stops there. For instance, in gender relations, you say, the woman is being objectified, or you can turn her into the active part of the thing. So I think what new materialists have in mind is that you can never leave this. This dualism between subject and object can be a prison, in as much as you can never, either you're active or passive, either you're dominating or you're being dominated. And most of all, one forgets that we're all which is pretty obvious, but in some theoretical frameworks might be forgotten, that we're all living beings immersed in concrete living processes, and therefore already entangled. So then from Rick's perspective and from new materialist perspective, if you bring these living entanglements, the fact that life as a whole is a process where different entities cannot be easily separated, this can be not an instrument for critique, but already some sort of liberation, some affirmation of life. So in terms of the ecological crisis, this can provide some sort of an alternative already to the sort of relationships, to the instrumental relation to nature that we have, and that Christoph rightly emphasized, and I also agree that neo-materialism often lacks the stressing how this is a social process. Well, social process. Well, this is a process, a material process, and which has to do with capitalism, for instance. And very often, neo-materialists just say the Anthropocene, and so it seems like the problem is the human more than some specific form of relationship or metabolism between the human and the non-human. And in any case, I just wanted to, I think this was already in Christoph's answer. I just wanted to, emphasize why it's important, at least to keep in mind something that is being advanced by the new materialists.
Thanks, Arthur. Ernesto?
Buenas, ¿cómo andan? Yo no me animo a formular mi pregunta en inglés, así que lo voy a hacer en castellano. Igual es también un poco un comentario. En principio, bueno, nada, agradecerles muchísimo a ambos. Lo que pude leer del libro, la verdad me encantó. Y sus exposiciones estuvieron buenísimas, así que en principio muchas gracias. A mí me llamó la atención particularmente, o me gustó particularmente, el capítulo de Verlesen, porque yo de alguna manera estoy tratando de pensar algo similar en torno a el pensamiento de Walter Benjamin, ¿no? Tratando de rastrear cómo funcionaría la categoría de naturaleza en el pensamiento de Walter Benjamin, y se me ocurría que quizás, digamos, al ser uno de los antecedentes directos de la teoría crítica, o estar, digamos, en un lugar muy asociado a ella, podría ser una especie de puente con los nuevos materialismos, en el siguiente sentido, que yo lo que encuentro en Benjamin es una especie de afinidad un poco más grande con ideas y más cercanas a una visión, digamos, no tan objetivada, ¿sí? Y no tan, podemos decirle, muda de la naturaleza, ¿sí? Cuando Benjamin aborda este problema tan importante en Adorno y Horkheimer, ¿no? Que es cómo, de alguna manera, se vinculan el dominio de la naturaleza y el dominio del hombre por el hombre, ¿no? Benjamin, a partir de Fourier y de Paul Shepard, ¿sí? Trata de pensar, ¿sí?, otro vínculo posible entre seres humanos y naturaleza, mediante la técnica, sí, pero un vínculo en el que la técnica ya no sea el dominio humano de la naturaleza, sino que contribuya a una liberación también de la naturaleza, ¿no? Entonces creo que propone una especie de relación más dialógica, ¿sí? Y me parece que puede ser un enlace interesante para conectar las agendas de ambos programas, ¿no? De la teoría crítica y de los nuevos materialismos. Y también pienso, digamos, en relación a estas figuras de enlace, pienso en la tradición del ecosocialismo, ¿no? Bueno, justamente de Michael Lowitt, muy lector de Benjamin, y el libro de Jason Moore, ¿no? El capitalismo en la trama de la vida, que de alguna manera también intenta integrar la crítica marxista, ¿no? Con una cierta recuperación de elementos que tienen que ver con las críticas que se realizan desde los nuevos materialismos, ¿no? A las ideas más constructivistas, y a las ideas, digamos, más característicamente dualistas, ¿sí? Y bueno, en ese contexto, Moore propone el concepto que me pareció bastante interesante de biotariado, ¿no? Para tratar de pensar, ¿sí? Cómo también, digamos, la vida independiente, la vida no humana, ¿sí? Es, de alguna manera, sujeto de explotación capitalista, ¿no? Y desde siempre...
Perdón, ¿cuál es el concepto? Perdón, ¿lo puedes repetir el concepto?
Biotariado.
Ah, biotariado. Gracias.
Bueno, nada, un poco esos interrogantes, ¿no? Y pienso también que si de alguna manera podemos ver que una de las funciones, digamos, de la teoría del pensamiento crítico en general, ¿no? Ha tenido que ver con esta idea de desnaturalizar, ¿sí?, las relaciones sociales. Un poco me parece que a veces el nuevo materialismo no va tan en contra de eso, sino que apunta a también desnaturalizar la naturaleza misma, ¿sí? Como dice una película, como se dice en una película de Pasolini, no hay nada natural en la naturaleza, ¿no? Y me parece que un poco ese mismo ejercicio que se ha hecho dentro de las relaciones sociales es un poco lo que se está tratando de hacer dentro de las relaciones que podemos llamar naturales, ¿no?
Bien,
Eso un poco.
Bien, gracias Ernesto. Vamos a tratar de hacer los comentarios más concisos, así podemos traducirlos. I'm going to make a translation for Christoph. This is affinities between Benjamin and the new materialism. He thinks that new materialism, Benjamin has another vision of technology, another vision of nature. And he relates some positions of Benjamin with Michael Levy and the eco-socialism in terms of biotariado. It's a new term of Arthur. How do you see the?
How I would translate the term?
Yes.
No. Biotariat in connection to the proletariat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I understood half of the question. That's it's fine. Thank you.
Ah, okay, good. Okay.
Not everything, but I was getting most of it, I think.
Okay, so if you can answer.
I have a quick. Can I answer in English? Is that okay?
Yes, of course. Yes,
Yeah.
Always in English.
I think it's if you say that Benjamin is similar to new materialism, I would say that's true. It's a very interesting remark because now I need some time to expand on that. But I think one of the problems that Fatalism is hinting at in this book is that the early critical theory distinguished first nature and second nature, but then they treated it as one. So they made the distinction, but they didn't use the distinction. That means because second nature was very bad for them, capitalism is second nature, but it's not a good thing. But the second nature of capitalism is so powerful that it dominates first nature to the extent that there's no first nature. It's becoming the same. And that's the same as the anthropocentric, what's that? What's this word for the new epoch? Anthropocene. Anthropocene, yeah, the Anthropocene. It's basically that argument, right? That the second nature is eating first nature, and the only thing is that some people think it's a good idea, some people think it's a bad idea, and then Benjamin comes up with this idea: yes, we have to liberate nature, meaning first nature. Then the question is, how can we liberate first nature if the second nature is in control of first nature? I mean, that's the problem, right? And so that means we cannot go back like Rousseau or someone like that and just free it, right? That's impossible because it's under control of the second nature of capitalism. So we have to blow up capitalism, sprengen. I mean, this is the terms that he uses. No? And then there needs to be another second nature that somehow controls first nature in a different way, right? It's so that it doesn't mean that we are freeing first nature, but it's meaning that we control it in a different way. And this different way is very futuristic. You mentioned Fourier, I think, right? And these Bogdanov would be another one. So there's a very strange, I would say, strange technophilia. If you read this Fourier text, I mean, he says, yeah, the water will be colorful, it will be yellow and blue, and it will be very nice. You can fly to the Arctic because the Arctic, all the ice will be small, you know, it will be gone, everything will be nice and warm. And that sounds very disturbing in a way. It's freeing nature, but it's freeing nature by controlling it in another way. We will have a socialist second nature, and that will free nature because first nature will be socialist as well, industrialized as well. And that's So I would see there is a similarity between Benjamin and new materialism, but that's disturbing for me. And yeah, Arthur, maybe you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I was thinking about the part where Ernesto was talking about the notion of denaturalization, and that would be shared by both critical theory and new materialism. And I think in a way, I agree in a way. And I was thinking, I mean, very, very in broad terms, especially if we take Habermas and then we contrast it with the new materialists. So Habermas is saying, so nature is something that we can only have an instrumental relation to it. It's like an objective world, and that's it. So nature is inert for Habermas. It's the mechanical nature ruled by laws. And new materialism is saying, no, nature is more fluid, it's processual, it's active, it's vital, etc., etc. And these are two, I think the first generation actually, a bit different from what we wrote in the introduction, but it was about making a point. I think the first generation of critical theory, and even Lukács as well, I've been writing on Lukács, so I have it in my mind, provides a way out of this in a way that, because for Adorno and Horkheimer, the argument is that nature is being made inert. And so the general argument is that nature, by being disenchanted, is being made inert as something that you can just grab and do whatever you want. But there's a revolt against this. This is not, and of course, this process always also makes us inert. It also naturalizes us in that sense, that makes us fixed, rigid, etc. Also things that just can be grabbed and can be quantified, calculated, etc. But this process, it doesn't end in itself. It has a revolt. There's a revolt, which is precisely those aspects of nature that were repressed, which is like nature, which are precisely the aspects of nature that new materialism is stressing. The fact that it's a living process, a qualitative process, etc., etc. Then what I think that at least like from what I can remember now, so then I think the way that the first generation of critical theory poses the question is very interesting. But then like an answer, a proper affirmation never comes. It only comes, as the non-identical in Adorno. So this is where I think the new materialism can contribute, though I wouldn't agree with the way that they do it, but it's interesting that they're in a way they're trying to articulate what could be a positive relationship to nature, which is not merely instrumental, etc. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for the question.
Okay.
Gracias. Gracias a ambos.
Ok, MC me hizo una pregunta en el chat. ¿La querés leer o querés que la lea yo? ¿Cómo querés que hagamos?
Ahora está el micrófono.
Sí, sí.
Puedo intentar leerla, sí.
Perfecto.
Bueno, si no se me entiende, if you can't understand my English, it's written right there. So I was saying, when we approach the dualist scenario with regards to specific kinds of dualism that have political significance, say the woman-man dualism, we already think that there is an objectifying relationship playing, and then we say that we must overcome dualistic thinking in order to overcome this objectifying way of thinking and acting. Christoph said, if I understood it well, that it's not clear that the dualist way of thinking is the real or the only cause of our objectifying way of thinking. And that makes sense, but my question is, couldn't it be the case that our very ethical notions, those that we are trying to defend in the process of defeating dualism, that is the idea that objectifying is wrong, for example, are notions that depend on the object-subject dualism itself? That is, if we overcome dualism, do we have any kind of justification for the ethical notions that we are trying to defend by overcoming dualism? That is my question.
I have a quick Can I quickly?
Yeah,
I
yes,
think,
perfect. Yeah.
again, it's a very, very, I would say, smart. I mean, yes, it's definitely to the point. That's the reason why Heidegger was not writing an ethics, because he thought that's going to get us back into the old mess of, well, he said European metaphysics, or I mean, basically meaning subject-object distinction, right? So he didn't want to do it, and he was up to something like the new materialists were. But I would like to defend ethics. I mean, in a way, you can say that the German idealism, the idea of ethics in German idealism really was to make everything a subject. I mean, we cannot, I mean, because being a subject means freedom, right? I mean, if you are free, you are a subject. That means in ethics, which is, of course, only applying to human beings in the old way. And that means everybody should be free. That means everybody should be treated as a subject. And that's true. And what about objects then? I mean, that means there are no objects because everybody is a subject. But then the criticism is, okay, what about nature? What about stones? What about, let's say, streets or cars or, I mean, everything that is not one person or two persons, or what about social structures? And then I would say, in a way, that's part of the problem, but we don't solve that problem. I mean, we can try to include objects into ethics, and that would be like the traditional way of environmental ethics, which says that, okay, we have responsibilities not only for other subjects, but also for animals, which might be subjects, but only in a limited sense. We also for trees, also for the future. So that means we have to include objects into subjects, but they still remain objects. And why can we not get loose of this subject-object distinction? Because ethics is about action, activity, and activity presupposes something like consciousness and responsibility. I mean, you have to be to pay for what you do, right? I mean, so you need to have a notion of what you do and what you can do in another way, or and this is something that I think we cannot, if we give away that, we give away the whole idea of ethics. So I think there is some very, very strong connection between thinking ethically and thinking in a subject-object distinction, and we cannot get rid of it. Is that an answer to that question? So
yes.
So, hence, I would say the subject-object distinction cannot be the problem, because sometimes we need it.
I don't know if I can make a brief
Yes,
statement.
yes.
I agree, and I even think what bothers me is that when we say, for example, well, now let's just include objects in ethics in some or other way. My question is, where does the intent of including objects come from? Why do we want to include objects? I mean, aren't we presupposing some kind of subjectivity in objects, or some value that it's intrinsic to subjectivity in objects? So now, in turn, we want to include objects as objects from a subjectivist presupposition. That is, why do we have the idea that what we are doing now is wrong and we need to include the other things in our ethics? I mean, it seems to me that we are introducing some kind of supposition that implies some kind of subjectivism. If that's not the case, I do not understand where does our intention of inclusion comes from.
Arthur, may I give a quick answer? I try. I think it's because maybe new materialism was right, that in the traditional way, we thought like there's not only subject and objects, but there's so many other things that are connected to that. For example, having rights, having dignity, or all of these things come with being a subject. And this is the mistake, not thinking about subject and object, but rather putting all of the good thoughts on the subject side. And that's the mistake, because of course, animals have dignity. I mean, and they should have rights. And forests should have rights. And that means that, you see what I mean? Because we forgot that they do, now we have to include it ethically. We have to, because otherwise the planet will blow up. But that doesn't mean that they're subjects. They're still objects, but they have rights. But that means that somehow we need to include them because of their ethical standing. You know what I mean? So we have the two possibilities. Either we say, okay, subject, object, all the same, doesn't matter. So that would solve the problem maybe, or we can say, yeah, or we have to include stones, the universe, the moon. Should the Americans or the Chinese be allowed to dump the moon with some rubbish or not? I mean, that's an open question, but see what I mean? I think it's about dignity and rights, basically.
Arthur, you want to answer?
Yeah, I was thinking of something. I mean, it's an interesting question. This idea, yeah, the topic of we ascribing subjectivity to things, or whether things, other non-human elements have subjectivity, and it brought me to animism. So, and this is interesting because, so one example, like the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. So he worked with the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, and then, so in a way, for these peoples, every entity, every being has a subjectivity. So every being has a spirit. So then you ask, so where's the difference, right? And then they say, no, the difference is that we have different bodies. So it's not that, because our view, our Occidental Western view, is that we all have bodies, that's what we have in common, but we humans have spirit. So by changing this perspective, I mean, it complicates. So I don't know how to solve this, but it's just, I think it's an interesting idea. And for some reason, which is probably connected to this ontology, they had a very different relationship to nature, which didn't lead to its destruction as we have been leading. So it's interesting to to think, what does it mean to think of subjectivity in those very different terms? In any case, I would take also like a step back from new materialism in this sense, and say that, yeah, nevertheless, we start from a context that is where we as subjects are objectifying nature and completely forgetting, in practical terms, even though we might think about it, we're completely forgetting in practical terms that we're entangled with it. It's just so we cannot not start from that, from subject, object, and all the dualisms. We have no choice but to start from that. And then the question is, how do we transform it? And that's the challenge. Instead of simply saying, oh, we have animism, let's do that. It's not that simple. So that's me trying to argue that we cannot avoid the duality. But we cannot simply jump into a non-dualistic monism, as new materialists tend to do. So the challenge is how to move from one to the other in thinking and in practice.
Ok, thanks, Arthur. Tenemos aquí otra pregunta. Nair, ¿querés leerla?
Sí, dale, puedo intentar leerla. Thanks, Christoph, Arthur, for the presentation. My commentary question is written on the chat. Well, unintendedly, it has a very strong connection with the previous one. My commentary is that I was thinking about the opposition between the individual and the network. For example, a tree and birds that spread its seeds and fungi that carries nutrients, in which there is not one without the other. No? I mean, the relation constitutes what we then call an individual. So my question is, do you think that it can be seen that as a dualism? And if not, what will be the political potential of the notion of entanglement or interaction. So thank you very much.
Gracias, Nair. Who wants to answer first?
It's a
Professor
tricky-
Henning. Do you want to answer first, Professor Henning? Or Arthur? Whoever wants to.
Arthur, you want to go? I think this is a very tricky question because now we are not talking about subject and object any longer, but about something else, which is the individual and the, let's call it the group, or you said the network, because it includes objects. And in a way, the tricky thing about that is that you cannot make a distinction here, because of course, let me talk about groups, or in the family, right? There's the family and there's the family member. Can that be a dualism? No. I mean, at least it cannot be an ontological dualism, because the one is part of the other, right? Where can we have a dualism? I mean, we can still have, epistemologically speaking, we can take the perspective of the group and we can take the perspective of the individual. And of course, one of the main ethical, let's say, currents of the 1980s, communitarianism or socialism, as we want, was stressing the role of the group, of course, right? That means that, yes, the family should have ethical standing, not only individuals, but also the group, the village, let's say, the family, the community, blah, blah, right? And you cannot pose the individual against it because he's depending on it, right? And now the problem is that, of course, you can pose it against each other. And that's where ethics comes in. And that's where I think we need to have at least, we have to be open for distinctions. Because I would say when it comes like to a fight, I would always defend the right of individuals against the right of groups. But that's a question of belief, I think. But you cannot ask that question. You know, if your family tells you, no, we don't want to support you anymore because you are of the wrong political opinion. Does it give the family, because they are 4 and you are 1, does it give them the right to kick you out because the family is so important? No, I would say no. The individual has also, I mean, so that you need to have an ethical judgment that somehow caters for both. But in order to make the judgment, you need to make the distinction between, you know, ethical values on that side, ethical values on that side. And if you don't make that distinction, you jump over the problem. The problem never gets a solution. So that means you have to use these differentiations, and whether or not that's a dualism, I would say no, it's not a dualism because it's not ontological. It's not ontological. It's a question of which perspective do you take. There's always more than one.
Okay, thanks. Arthur, do you want to say something?
Yeah, because I thought about one of the chapters of the book, which is Martin Zar's chapter on Spinoza, and I thought that it could be interesting for that sort of question, because the Spinozist perspective, in a way, perhaps deals better with these issues that the usually non-materialist, perhaps, because you have a network, as you said, you know, you have the idea that you have powers, you have a network of powers, but you have both individuals and then you have a network. So you have both the idea that there are individual entities, each of which has its own conatus, its own way of striving and persisting into being, and at the same time they're affected. Exactly, it's a relationship of affection all the time. So then you have, the possibility of thinking both of the potential of this specific being in this network and also the potentials of the network itself. Then the only question for me precisely is, because in his chapter, Martin Zar says, well, this contributes to critique, but it's not necessarily critical. Because then, of course, where it's coming from, where is critique coming from? And I think this is an important question for this sort of perspective, which is, where is this ontology coming from? Why do we need that ontology? You cannot just simply throw it. So that's where I think critique would come from. We see the problems of capitalism or our society, and then, we need this sort of ontology to answer these sorts of critical questions, etc.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you both.
We've been with the presentation like 2 hours. We have like 15 more minutes, or it's okay? Perfect. So I have 2 short questions for both of you. One is concerning, I was interested in Barat's theory, and I see that this entanglement between ontology and epistemology seems to me like very close to a constructivism, like she's trying to critique. So in which way this entanglement between ontology and epistemology is different from constructivism? And the other question is concerning Honeg's theory between society and nature. Where do you see the subordination of nature to spirit, or the subordination to nature of nature to society? In which works and in which ideas do you see this subordination of matter, nature to spirit, and society? Can you understand the questions, or I need to? Okay.
No, it's clear. It's clear. I'm thinking about them. Maybe, but maybe I mean, I get the point that Barat falls back into constructivism, but maybe you could elaborate a bit more, just that it gets clearer. Or do you want to say something? Yeah, sure.
Just quickly to the Barrett thing, I think the difference is that constructivism, if I understand that right, I mean, that's radical constructivism, they would say there's nothing out there. It's everything is a construction of our minds and brains, or of social construction. That means there is no ontological, validity of anything that we project. If we construct it differently, it will be different. Barrett doesn't buy that. She says as I understand it, what's out there is real. It's completely real, but it's not different from what we think about it. So our thinking of it is as real as the thing itself. In fact, it's the same thing. So that means what is similar, and I think there you're right, is that there's no difference. But the claim is that doesn't make it unreal. I mean, for the whole point that it's one thing gives it its reality, whereas in social constructivism it takes away the reality, and that's the difference. It's called it's social constructivism turned upside down, I would say. I mean,
yeah, but I think the scientist in the laboratory constructs his object, or he's not reflecting anything.
But it doesn't mean that it's not existing. It's still existing. I mean, that's the thing in Latour, which I always struggled with. I mean, he's not a nihilist or something. He really believes that the things are real, even though we constructed them. I mean, and that's the thing that he always repeats. And yes, they are constructed, but they are real. And you always think because they are constructed, they're not real. And what is real cannot be constructed. And that's the mistake. Constructed, but real. And in a way, I mean, you were starting with the notion of labor, right? Trabajo means working. That's the whole idea of this Hegelian, social ontology, that of course, yes, the whole society is constructed, but not in the brain, but of course by manual labor, by social institutions and so on. And saying that it's constructed doesn't make it unreal. So in a way, her point is just extending that Marxian materialism into nature, which is maybe, and Arthur already said that there's a long debate in Lukács and also the late Engels, what to do with nature. I mean, it doesn't really fit into this historical materialism. And she just does it that way, that she says it's the same. I mean, we construct society, we construct nature, we construct everything, but it's still real.
Yeah, but that position, I think, is very close to social constructivism or Marxist constructivism. There's construction, but there's reality in that construction. We construct society, we construct the institution of society, we construct social ontology, but that's real and that's construction. And there's a long history of social construction, Berger and Luhmann and Lukács, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes sense when one considers I mean, the poorer version of social constructivism that she is fighting against. I mean, she's fighting against this postmodern, 1990s social constructivism going nuts in a way. But you're right that if you consider the Marxian perspective, social constructivist, then yeah, things get more interesting there, I think, in the debate. And just one point about Barat, I agree with what Christoph said. I think it's interesting that, well, her argument about diffraction is that, okay, we find out in an experiment in a laboratory that two waves of light, they go into an obstruction, and then they turn into multiplicities, and they entangle, and then she says then the scientists can decide whether it depends. That's the entanglement between the observer and the observed. You can decide whether you can make these waves of light waves or particles, and so you can choose in a way to see them as elements, discrete elements, or entangled processes. But these means that they're both. I mean, in quantum theory, from what I read by her, from reading her, as far as I know, it means that they're both. They're both waves and particles. But then in her whole theory, she goes the way to, no, they're waves. So anyways, I just find that, yeah, a tricky thing. About going to Honneth, I find it difficult to find an instance in Honneth where I wouldn't see that, like that strong notion of spirit. But maybe, you probably have a different view on this. But I was trying to think about an example, and I found it in his argument. He wrote a paper in 2014 on the notion of diseases of society or social pathology in that debate. And then he was proposing, okay, if we're going to talk about diseases of society, we need to see society as an organism. But then he was very emphatic in saying that this does not mean that society is actually an organism. There's a metaphor here. There's a metaphorical relationship between the organic body and society as if it were an organism. And I think this is an instance where it shows that he has difficulties in seeing the connection between the organic and the social. He could have said, a new materialist probably would try to say, no, society is an organism. It's a super organism or whatever. It's just part of life. There's a continuity. Whereas Honneth was very decided into saying, no, these are very different things. So I think this is an instance where the fact that the notion of social pathology in that context could only act as a metaphor and not a literal notion.
Yeah, but he has this Hegelian background, so it's difficult to think about it in terms of this strict separation between, say, society and nature. He's not so naive to think, okay, nature is one thing and society is a completely different thing. He has this Hegelian background when he's trying to think society. He's trying to think mediations, and you cannot separate society from nature just like that. That's the point with Honneth, I think. And it's difficult to find, I think, a place or idea that is just against nature. That is a complete subordination of nature to the spirit or to society or to. But
I think the reason for that, I would see is that he takes over. That's the way. Maybe it's a little primitive, but he takes over from Habermas. And Habermas did all the work to get rid of nature in a way, right? Against metaphysics. What's metaphysics? Science is metaphysics because they claim objectivity, right? They claim some being or substance, and that's all of that it's not discourse, and that's why it's somehow dubious. And Habermas did also kept Marx out of the critical theory in a way. So. And after that, you had this Kantian Habermas cosmos, I would say, and nature was no longer included, except human nature. Human nature is very important. This book from 2002, I think. But then Horner takes over and enriches the Kantian story with Hegel, and a lot of society comes in, a lot of intersubjectivity, a lot of, you know, family and love and affection. But since in the Habermasian story there was no nature any longer, at least not in the 80s, I think it's just not there. I mean, he doesn't say it's bad. It's just not a topic that he talks about much. I mean, in the socialism book, I think he says we should give charity to Greenpeace, and okay, yes, I agree, but that's not a philosophy of nature in any substantial sense, I would say.
Okay. Bueno, si no hay ninguna pregunta más, yo tendría una última. Okay, just one last question. I think that new materialism is strong based in artistic practices. If I'm not wrong, it's not a problem that there's a lack of social theory behind the developments of new materialism. I think there's not a need to a deep treatment of the old topics of social theory, like structure and agency, objectivism, and participatory view. These old topics of social theory deserve more attention in new materialism. There's a lack of social theory.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, I was thinking, that, but it's indeed a trick. I would say, for sure that it lacks social theory. But then there's the challenge is that I'm gonna say, I mean, specifically sociological theory, I mean, was built from neo-Kantianism. By large, I mean, of course, there's many perspectives. There's Marxism, etc. But sociology as a discipline was institutionalized on the basis of neo-Kantianism, like Durkheim and even the Georg Simmel. That was the sociologist was neo-Kantian, and then Parsons, and then so I think it's very difficult to combine these perspectives, even though I wouldn't just leave it at that. But for and I think, I mean, trying to advocate for new materialism a bit is that they're trying to develop a different language to speak about nature and all these things. So it matches the aesthetic in a way. So the way that Jane Bennett writes, for instance, is very literary and actually, we are. I mean, she came to Erfurt and gave a talk, and she said that she wrote like that. Actually, the writing comes before the thought in a way. So that, you know, she writes a beautiful sentence and then she sees where it goes. Okay, so but I totally agree. This is not enough. I mean, then you have all these problems that we discussed.
What's the question? Where's the social theory in new materialism?
I think that new materialism is strong based in artistic practices. But I think there's a lack of social theory in new materialism. And
it's true, but I discovered maybe too late after the book that the key to that is Donna Haraway's early work, because she was a Marxist. Before while she was becoming a feminist, technology, blah blah, and the more you go back, the more you can see what the idea of social science behind it is. I think that was really an eye opener for me. So I wouldn't say it's absent. It's just it's presupposed, and then they don't talk about it any longer. They take it for granted, and maybe that's too dangerous in a way, because the next generation will have forgotten about it. So it's important to read the old text, I would say.
Okay, so no hay más preguntas. There's no more questions. Okay.
Tengo una breve solo si hay tiempo y si no les molesta.
Just one tiny question.
Christoph, I'm sorry, I have no camera this time. My battery ran out. When you answered my previous question, you said something like, well, we should not subjectify objects in a sense, but we should recognize some attributes in objects that we usually recognize in us, such as dignity and rights. My question is, when we do that, aren't we, in a sense, simply taking out the name, the word, subject, and attributing attributes that, in a sense, end up being attributes of a subject? Aren't we subjectifying without using the word subjectifying? If we say, well, this rock is not a subject, but it has rights, it has dignity, it has, etc., etc. I mean, the rights, the dignity, the very notion of rights and dignity came out of the notion of subject in the first place. It's founded, grounded in that notion. So can we say objects have rights and dignity without saying objects are subjects, in a sense?
That is a tricky question again. I mean, you are right that this is exactly what I'm repeating myself, what some people in the ecology movement did when they said, of course, I mean, what's a subject? I mean, a subject is a being that can feel, for example, right? We reserve that right for us. And all of a sudden we see, okay, fish can feel, plants can feel. That means, yeah, now the question is, does that mean they're a subject, right? You seem to assume that that doesn't mean that. And if that would be the price to pay, I would say, okay, yes, then we subjectivize in a way plants and animals. It gets a little bit more complicated with mountains, for example, or should we preserve a landscape? Does the landscape have feelings? That's where it doesn't work. And I would say, yes, we have to preserve the landscape. We have to preserve the rainforest, for example. Even the rainforest as such doesn't have feelings. It's not a subject, right? So that means that there is this possibility that we say we subjectivize plants and animals. And by that, Hans Jonas did that, and I think Schelling, the whole objective idealism, did it in a certain way, because they said spirit is in nature. It's just, it hasn't found itself, but it's trying to get free, right? And then, but it's already a kind of subject, and you can go that way. And I would say it's only half of what we want to achieve. We want to go a little bit further, and that means we have to detach the notion of having rights and having dignity from being a subject. Why should only subjects, whatever a subject means, why should only they have it? I mean, it's so important that we have landscapes that are intact, even if they are not subjects. So that means we have to decouple the notion of being a subject or not, and having rights or being worthy of existence, right? To have a right to exist shouldn't be reserved for subjects. And that's, I think, is more successful. I mean, to just decouple the subject-object question from ethical questions. It's not to reserve it only to so-called subjects. We could go on fighting about that, I think.
Yes, that's a good answer, and I agree we could keep arguing forever. So I think we can leave it there. It's a tricky question, I admit it, and I like your answer. So thank you very much.
Arthur, do you want to say something about it?
No, I'll be happy with the consensus that's established.
Okay, I think we have come to an end. Okay, it was great to have you both discussing this book, this great book. We are continuing discussing these topics between new materialism, and we are going to keep reading Christoph and Arthur. Thanks very much for being with us. And okay, we keep in touch, and we are developing this thing a little further. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Leandro. Thank you all for participating, for being here, for organizing this great event.
Okay.
And sorry for my missing language skills. I'm sorry.
Okay, it was perfect. It was perfect. It was perfect. Okay. Okay. Gracias a todos. Thanks. Bye.